So I think we should probably get into some of the details of why I think we're confused about what consciousness is.
Yes.
But just to finish this point, I think that we don't actually have any evidence that consciousness is complex, that it comes out of complex processing, that it's required for complex processing. And I think we've made this anthropomorphic mistake because we are conscious and it's very hard to get evidence. It's one of the things that makes consciousness unique and mysterious, and why I'm fascinated with it is it's the one thing in nature that we can't get conclusive evidence of from the outside. We can, by analogy, you're behaving basically the same way I behave, more or less. You talk about your conscious experiences, and therefore I just extrapolate from that you're having a felt experience in the way I am, and we can do that throughout nature. Well, there's no physical evidence. There's nothing we can observe from the outside that will give us conclusive proof that consciousness is there. And so I think we've made this leap to, because we're conscious and because we're unique and special and complex and intelligent in the way that we are, and because we don't have an intuition that anything else is conscious, or we have no feedback about it, we've made this assumption that consciousness, that those things aren't conscious, and felt experience does not exist out there in other atoms and forms of life even, but especially not inanimate objects. And therefore, consciousness is somehow tied to these other things that make us unique. That consciousness arises when there is this complex processing. When there is, we can talk about the evolution argument too, which I think is super interesting to get into. And I'm hoping to talk to Richard Dawkins about this for my series.
What do you think about consciousness?
He's not interested. He's not interested. And actually, the conversation I would have with him would be very brief because he's just not that interested in this topic. But let's go back to the Richard Dawkins piece, because I feel like there's a lot to talk about here in terms of our intuitions about consciousness, what it's doing, why in my book and everywhere I talk about consciousness, I bring it back to these two questions that I think are at the heart of our intuitions about consciousness. And so your questions about whether human beings are unique and special and all of that, I think are interesting questions and something we could talk about. I see them as separate questions from the consciousness question.
So you see consciousness as giving a felt experience to our uniqueness, as opposed to the uniqueness giving birth to consciousness.
Yes, and that potentially there is felt experience, even though it sounds crazy even to me, that there is felt experience in all matter. And at this point in my thinking, and after a few conversations with some physicists, I think if consciousness is fundamental, the only thing that actually makes sense is that it is part of the most fundamental that space-time and everything else emerges out of.
Out of consciousness.
Felt experience is just part of the fabric of reality.
So is it possible to intuit this? Can we start by thinking about dogs and cats, go to the plants, and then going all the way to matter? Or is this going to be like modern physics, where it's just going to be impossible to even through our reason alone, like we're going to have tools of some kind?
I think it'll be a little bit of both. I mean, I think the science has a very long way to go. And the truth is, I don't even think we can get to the science yet, because we have to do this work. And this is why I'm so passionate about this work. And it's really taking hold. I mean, there are scientists, neuroscientists and physicists interested in consciousness, and kind of having gotten over the initial obstacle of wrestling with these intuitions, so that it's now being talked about in a serious way, which was the first huge hurdle. But I think a lot more of that has to happen. A lot more of the intuition breaking from the science we already have. I mean, I think we almost need to catch our intuitions up to what we already know. And then continue to break through these intuitions systematically so that we can really think more clearly about consciousness. There are a couple of scientists now working on theories of consciousness, which they don't quite go to the fundamental level, but they go extremely deep, so that something like an electron might be conscious under their theory. This is integrated information theory, IIT, with Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi. I've spoken to both of them. I spoke to Christoph Koch once or twice for this project I'm working on now. What they're working on is incredibly interesting to me, and I think very important work. However, I think they are also really led by some false intuitions about self and free will. And I think
like
that
what?
will be a limit to their work. So we can get into that, but
let's go.
We will.
Christoph Koch
Let me just complete
awesome.
my thought,
yes,
which is that what they're working on, I think, is the most important next step forward, which is just even being open to the fact that consciousness goes as deep as particles.
And being rigorous.
But even their theory isn't going as deep as I think we need to go. And it's hard to say how we could actually study this scientifically, but that's part of the reason why I'm such a supporter of IIT and why I'm so interested in what they're doing, even though I think they're wrong, is because they're opening this path there, and I think they're getting more people interested. And I think, it'll be. It's hard for me to imagine what the science will actually look like. But
okay, so your
I'm
intuition,
optimistic.
or
Yeah.
at least the direction which you're pushing, is that consciousness is the only fundamental thing in the universe, that everything else, like time, all those kinds of things, emerge from that.
I will say that what I believe at this point, I've been saying 50-50 for a long time. I'd say now it's like 51-49 in terms of consciousness being emergent versus fundamental. So I am not convinced of this at all. I'm not convinced that consciousness is fundamental. What I think is there are very good reasons to think it could be. And essentially all of science up to this point has been led by the other assumption, by the first assumption that consciousness arises at some point, namely in brains. And that's where all the science has gone. And I think that's wonderful. And I think it should keep on going. And I actually think that was a more important place to start. But I think there's a possibility that the correct assumption is that it's fundamental. And so that's the science I support. That's the thing I spend a lot of my time thinking about and talking to scientists and philosophers about. And so I shouldn't give the idea that I actually have crossed over into believing this is the case, but it's the assumption I follow in my work at this point.
It's a possibility, an understudied possibility, so it deserves serious, rigorous attention.
And there are good reasons to start with that assumption versus the other that I think we're just now starting to realize.
So just to clarify, when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about the hard problem of consciousness, that it feels like something to, there's a subjective experience. Do we, if consciousness permeates all matter, it's fundamental, is that going to be somehow, is our current intuition about consciousness like the very tiny subset of what consciousness actually is? So like we have our intuitions about personal experiences, like what it feels like, what it tastes to eat a cookie or something like that. But that seems like a very specific implementation of consciousness in an organism. So how can we even reason about something that's, if consciousness is fundamental, how can we reason about that? Like,
I'm not sure I'm understanding the connection between those two things, but
when you think about what it's like to be a plant, to experience a thing, okay, we can kind of get that. We can kind of understand that.
There are a lot of places we could go with this. One is there's actually work being done by people like David Eagleman. He's a neuroscientist. I don't know if you know him.
Yes.
You should talk to him for your podcast if you haven't. He's wonderful. Great science communicator. He's someone I interviewed for my current project too. So he's done this actually. Okay, there are many places we can go. One is he does work with sensory addition, sensory substitution, and this is going in some very interesting directions and maybe partly answers your question, which is giving humans qualia, sensory experiences that we're not wired for, that human beings have never had before. You let me know what you're most interested in hearing about. But we could talk about things like the brain port. There was actually a study done. I just talked to one of the participants in the study where they were seeing if they could give human beings an experience of magnetic north. So other animals have this this sense that we don't have, where they can feel intuitively the way that our eyes work to give us an intuitive sense of our environment. We don't have to translate the information coming in through our eyes. We just have a map of the external world and we can navigate it. So many animals use a sense of magnetic north to get around, and it's an intuitive sense. So I spoke to someone who was in this part of this experiment, and it was fascinating to hear him acquire a sense not only that he had never had, but that no human being had ever had. So when I asked him to describe the experience, it was challenging for him, and understandably so, because it would be like you describing sight to someone who's never seen. But this is clearly possible, and scientists like David Eagleman and others are working on these. And so I do think it's possible that these scientific advancements may actually start to dovetail with the consciousness research in terms of being able to experience things we've never experienced before. But I do think that at some level, yes, we're limited as human beings. We may be able to find some proof or enough proof to at least assume that consciousness is fundamental, or, who knows, one day actually believe that that's the correct scientific view of things, and not really be able to get our minds around that or to understand what it means, and certainly not to know what it feels like. I mean, we don't even know what it feels like to be other creatures.
Maybe we'll
I don't know what it's like to be you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what empathy is about. That's what I try to exercise, is try to imagine what it's like to be other people. Yeah. And then you're doing that even farther with P tendrils. But perhaps we can do that thing more rigorously by connecting different sensory mechanisms to the brain, to do that for all kinds of organisms on Earth. But they're similar to us in scale and the time at which they function, the time scale and the spatial scale. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's much more difficult to do for electrons and so on.
Some of the intuitions I talked about, I mean, I just I'm taking them for granted that you and everyone knows what I'm talking about. But in terms of the science, in terms of the studies, understanding things like binding processes, understanding just a little bit about how the brain works, and as far as we understand, and that there's just a ton of evidence now to support that our conscious experience is at the tail end of a lot of brain processing.
So she tells a story.
Yeah, so just a little bit. I mean, I give in the example in my book, I talk about tennis and the binding of the sights and sounds and felt experience of hitting a tennis ball, which in the world are happening at different times. The rates it takes the sound waves and the light waves and the felt sensation to travel to my brain are different. That there are these binding processes that happen prior to the conscious experience that were essentially delivered to us by the brain. And so we can get back into this. I can answer your bigger question first, but I feel like for a lot of people to understand some of the science that already is shattering some of our intuitions about the role consciousness plays, I think is helpful in terms of being able to be open to thinking about these other ideas.
Let's go there. Where the heck does consciousness happen in what we understand about the brain timing-wise? I mean, this connects to conscious will too, our experience of free will.
Yeah. There is this period of time, and it's depending on the situation and the behavior, it can be anywhere from, it's essentially half a second. There's 200 milliseconds. I actually don't know. I was going to compare it to the timing of syncing film and sound. I don't know if you know this.
Yeah, unfortunately, I know this very well.
You do?
The film and sound?
Yeah, like
yes.
How the timing has to work so that so that our experiences of it happening at the same time.
Let me just sit in the silence of it. There's been so much pain on this one point.
Sorry,
so much
I had no
suffering.
idea.
So, I mean, I did a lot of algorithms on automatic synchronization of audio and video
Right,
and all these
right.
kinds of things. No, I know this well. There's a lot of science and there's a lot of differences, but it's about, and people claim it's about 100 milliseconds. You can't tell the difference, but it's much more like 30 to 50 milliseconds.
Okay.
And you can go nuts trying to see if something is in sync or not.
Yes.
Is it in sync or not?
Well, also,
Am I out of sync right now?
Your brain is constantly making adjustments.
Yeah.
And so it can shift for you while you're doing that, which is probably part of the thing that's driving you crazy. Okay. So I'll start with binding processes and then I'll just give a couple of examples. So yes, there's this window where your brain is essentially putting all of the information together to deliver you a present moment experience that is most useful for you to navigate the world. So as I said, and I use this example of tennis in my book. So the sights and sounds are coming at us at different rates. It takes longer for a sensation in my hand when I hit the ball with the racket to travel to my brain than it does for the light waves to hit my retina and get processed by the brain. So all these signals are coming in at different times. Our brains go through this process of binding to basically weave it all together so that our conscious experience of that is of seeing, hearing, and feeling the ball hit the racket all at the same time. I mean, that's obviously most useful to us. Binding is mostly about timing. It can be about other things. But I was just talking to David Eagleman, who was talking about a very simple experiment, actually. And this kind of shows how your brain is basically always interacting with the outside world and always making adjustments to make its best guess about the most useful present moment experience to deliver. So this is a very simple experiment. This is from many, many years ago. And David Eagleman was involved in this research where they had participants hit a button and that button caused a flash of light. And so our brains, through binding, the brain, it notices, is able to kind of calibrate the experience you have because the brain is aware that it is its own hand that is causing the light to flash, that there's this cause and effect going on. And so you have this experience of pushing the button that causes the flash of light, which is true, and the light flashes. You can start to introduce longer pauses, starting with 20 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, going up to, I think, 100, maybe even 200 milliseconds, where if you do it gradually, since your brain is making the adjustment, you can introduce a delay. I think it's up to 200 milliseconds. If you do it gradually, you will still have the experience, even though there's now a delay between when you hit the button and the light flashes, you will still have the exact same experience you had initially, which is that the light flashes right when you push the button. In your experience, nothing is changing. But then, so they gradually give a delay. You've acclimated to that because it was done gradually. If they then go back to the original instantaneous flash, your brain doesn't have time to make the adjustment, and you have the experience that the light flashed before you hit the button. And that is your true experience. It's not like you're confused, but that is, your brain didn't have time to make that adjustment. You think you're in the same environment. You're pushing the button. It makes the light flash. It's kind of calibrating all the time. But then the participants are suddenly saying, oh, wait, that was so weird. The light flashed before I hit the button. And so these types
That's crazy.
They built a Rochambeau, rock, paper, scissors computer game that was unbeatable based on this glitch that you can present in binding by training someone. If you introduce a delay slowly enough, then the computer can get the information before it responds, but you still have the experience that you're both throwing out your rock or paper, scissors at the same time. But in actuality, the computer saw your choice before it makes its choice. And it's in this window of milliseconds where you don't notice it.
So that starts to help you build up an intuition that this conscious experience is an illusion. constructed by the brain after
conscious will.
Conscious will.
Yeah, and just in general that consciousness is not the thing that we feel it is, which is driving the behavior. That is actually at the tail end of it. And so a lot of decision-making processes, and there are studies that are more controversial, and I don't usually like to cite them, although if you want to talk about them, we can. They're super interesting and intuition shattering. But there are now studies specifically about free will to see if there are markers at the level of the brain that can see what decision you're going to make and when you make that decision. And I think the neuroscience inevitably is just going to get better. And so part of the reason I'm so passionate about this, I mean, there's the science and there's just the curiosity that drives me of wanting to understand how the universe works. But I actually see a lot of the neuroscience presenting us with truths that are going to be difficult for us to accept. And I actually think there are really positive ways to view these truths that we're uncovering. And even though they can be initially kind of jarring and even destabilizing and creepy, I think ultimately there's actually a lot. It can have a positive effect on human psychology and a whole range of things that I and others have experienced, and that I think it's important for us to talk about because you can't hide from the truth, especially in science, right? Like it will reveal itself. And if this is true, I think not only for better understanding the universe and nature, which is kind of my primary passion, it's important for us to absorb these facts and realize that it doesn't necessarily take away the things from us that we fear. I've heard people say, this is talked about, it's a common point to make or question to ask a scientist, can you still, enjoy chocolate if you're a molecular biologist? And is it a molecular biologist that would be the one who would understand how we experience chocolate? I have the wrong science.
Yeah.
But anyway, if you're focused on the details of the underlying nature of reality, does that take the joy and the pleasure and, for lack of a better word, spirituality out of our experience as human beings? And I actually think for these illusions like free will and self, the reverse is true. I actually think they are reasons and bases for feeling more connected to each other and to the universe, for spiritual experiences, for even just on a more basic level, for increasing our well-being, just in terms of our psychology, of lowering rates of depression and anxiety. And I actually think these realizations can be extremely helpful to people.
Well, it's like realizing that the universe doesn't rotate around Earth, that the Earth is not the center of the universe, is a really challenging thought.
Well, and people were worried about how that would affect society.
Well, yes, that's like long term, but short term, I bet you the number of people who had an existential crisis as it got integrated into society, that thought is huge. It's like, it's a hard one. And you're saying,
but it's also a source of awe. And so many people now use that fact to inspire a positive response, to inspire creativity and curiosity and awe and all of these things that are so useful for human well-being.
Where's the source of meaning when you're not the center of the universe, when the you doesn't even exist? That even you, the sense of self and the sense of decision making is an illusion.
The truth is that for the most part, the sense of self is kind of at the core of human suffering, because it feels as if we are separate from the rest of nature. We're separate from each other. We're separate from, the illusion that I referenced of feeling like, we have these thoughts that are brain-based thoughts, but then the I swoops in to make a decision. In some sense, it goes so deep that it's as if the I is separate from the physical world. And that separation plays a part in depression, plays a part in anxiety, even plays a part in addiction. So at the level of the brain, I think, stop me if I'm repeating myself, but we started talking about the default mode network. And so we actually know that when the default mode network is quieted down, when people lose a sense of self in meditation and on psychedelic drugs in therapy, there is a feeling that people describe of an extremely positive feeling of being connected to the rest of nature. And so that's a piece of it that I think if you haven't had the experience, you wouldn't necessarily know that would be a part of it. But truly having that insight that you're not the self you feel you are, immediately your experiences are embedded in the universe and you are a piece of everything and you see that everything is interconnected. And so rather than feeling like a lonely I in this bigger universe, there's a sense of being a part of something larger than yourself. And this is intrinsically positive for human beings. And even just in our everyday lives and choices and what we do for work, feeling part of something larger than yourself is the way people describe spiritual experiences and the way many positive psychological states are framed. And so there's that piece of it.
There is something, so one giant hug with the universe, everything in it. But there is some sense in which we attach the search for meaning with the I, with the ego. And it could almost seem like life is meaningless. Our existence, my existence is
I
meaningless.
think you can kind of go there under any worldview,
Right?
really.
Right.
Right. And the truth is, we want to find a truth out of that downward spiral and not a story that we have to tell ourselves that isn't true. Yeah. And the fact is, we have these facts available to us that with the right framing and the right context, looking at the truth actually provides us with that psychological feeling we're searching for. And I think that's important to point out.
I think humans are fascinatingly good at finding beauty in truth, no matter how painful the truth is. So yes.
I totally agree. Yes. But in this case, I think there are the concerns are legitimate concerns, and I have them myself for how people respond. I've actually had people tell me they had to stop reading my book halfway through because the parts on free will were so upsetting to them. And this is something I think about a lot because that kind of breaks my heart. Because I see this potential for these realizations bringing levels of well-being that many people don't have access to. I think it's important to talk about them in ways that override what can be an initial fear or kind of spooky quality that can come out of these realizations.
So at the end of that journey, there's a clarity and an appreciation of beauty that if you just write it out. By the way, if you want to read Upsetting, I just gotten through the 4 books. If you want to read Upsetting, so my Audible is hilarious. So it has Conscious in it, and then so your book, and then it has The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, probably the most upsetting book I've ever read. If you want to, because it's not just Stalin or Hitler, it's Stalin and Hitler. It's the worst hits, the opposite of the best hits. It's really, really, really well written, really difficult. I read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and what else? Red Famine, which is Anne Applebaum. Is that her? Yeah. Anyway, so those are truly upsetting, and and those are a lot of times the results of hiding the truth versus pursuing the truth. So truth in the short term might hurt, but it did ultimately set us free.
I believe that. And I also think whatever the truth is, we have to find a way to maintain civil society and love and all the things that are important to us.